Welcome to Chatting with Casey with your host, Casey Palmer.
Episode 17, Playing with People's Attention. Welcome to Chatting with Casey, the podcast that's all about family, food, fashion, and faith, and travel, and tech, and taking a stroll down memory lane to those simpler times when your biggest worry was how you'd spend the overabundance of time you always seem to have. If you can hear this, I just want to give you a massive thanks for continuing to join along for the ride while I hustle to make this content happen. As I speak, Sarah's a 4-hour flight away for a family funeral, so it's just me and the boys for a few days, and you know what? Hasn't been that bad. I set it up like an extended boys weekend, so there's been plenty to keep the days from growing stale, but man, has it been busy. Balancing the content, the 9 to 5, and everything I need to do to keep my boys from tearing our house apart, it's been a trip, yo. But let's talk comics. After doing an entire Chatting with Casey episode on nerd culture and all the things I got up to as a youngin', temporarily casting them aside for social acceptance, I realized it was time to bring it all back. The side of me that had fun drawing and debating superhero scenarios at the local comic book shop. I needed to find space for him again as I started embracing my creative side once more. And what better way to reignite that spark than to talk with someone who eats, breathes, and sleeps comics? The world of social media is a small one indeed, and that's how I got connected with Nelson Caetano, an artist from the Six who's looking to tell the story of his city through a project called The Gathering Place. Chatting with Nelson reminded me of my life almost 20 years ago when art was my everything. Sure, I had school and a job in banking, but with every spare moment I had, I got my hands grubby in my sketchbooks, convinced that my future was in my artwork. I'd spend weekends in Artist Alley at comic book conventions selling my work, sketching new work, or rubbing elbows with hundreds of other artists looking to do the exact same thing. And there were simpler times spent under my parents' roof. In an age before smartphones were as universal as they are today, my pencil is what was inseparable from my hand. But what all this is a long way of saying that I have a deep appreciation for the work that goes into a project like Nelson's. Now, to be honest, I tried to step away from Kickstarter. I'd hit a point in Toronto where I ran out of things I wanted to buy. On top of the fact that I struggled to find the time to use the stuff I already had, I put so much time into my creative work that anything I was buying was in the name of the brand rather than anything for my own personal enjoyment. But I shouldn't have worried, because Kickstarter's always got something for the man who thinks he has everything. But that goes both ways. Though I got cool stuff like fancy bags, luxury watches, and tools that had transformed my SLR camera into an automated cinematographer, I also got slapped with the bad end of exchange rates, surprise import fees, and discovering new solutions in the time it takes for things to get developed and delivered. Kickstarter's great conceptually, but a bit lacking in execution. But repping my city is something too important for me to turn away from. I won't spoil too much of the interview before you've had a chance to hear it, but Nelson's aiming to create a Toronto story in a way that's rarely done, by exploring its history from long before there even was a Toronto, noting that our city didn't just spring up out of nowhere. I got to talk to Nelson about his one-man anthology project, his history rooted deeply in the world of comics and visual art, and why you need to get on his fully funded Kickstarter project before time runs out. Let's get it. Hey everyone, so I am sitting here with, I'm sitting with my computer, and on the other side of the computer is Nelson Caetano. Nelson, how do you pronounce your name? I just want to make sure I get it right.
It is Caetano, yeah.
Yes.
No, you have perfect pronunciation, so that's awesome. You're one of the few.
Excellent. I will take it. Thank you. I appreciate that. So Nelson Caetano is one of the individuals who does one of my favorite, I guess, occupations / passions, which is he's an artist. He draws. He has a comic right now up on Kickstarter called The Gathering Place, which I'm going to have him talk plenty about because I'm sure he's far better qualified to speak on it than I am. And yeah, we'll talk a lot about why you've created it, what drives you, some of the fact that I grew up with tons of comics in my life, but we'll get there. Nelson, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing great. I'm really excited about this interview and talking all things comic books and talking art and having a great conversation.
Cool. So we were connected through your wife.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. She's been my greatest advocate. She promotes me to anyone and everyone who's willing to listen. So it's great to have a champion on my side, helping me promote my work.
That's amazing, because I think my wife is sick of hearing me promote myself all the time. So having a very different perspective on how that all goes together is amazing.
It's, you know what, it's a great balance. We're very different in many ways, but she definitely supports all my geek habits. And every time I try and say, you know what, I need to cut back, she's an enabler, and she buys me the latest action figure or whatever comic book. I decide I'm not going to pick this one up today, and she'll go around and she'll pick it up and surprise me with it. So she's great in that regard.
To contextualize this conversation better, let me tell you a bit about my background, and we'll kind of get in there and you can see where I'm coming from when it comes to this conversation. So I've been drawing since forever and a day. I came out of the womb with a pencil, as my mom liked to say. And I have these, spiral bound notebooks from high school and elementary school with different sketches I've been working on for years and years and years. And they're all atrocious. They're all horrible, but they're very, very, it's sentimentality that is like, oh, wow, at one point, this was like what I thought a story looked like and what I thought a character looked like, and all the things of youthful innocence as I, didn't have the degree of skill that I developed later on, but it's still like you can see the imagination there as I try to put it all together and make it work. Part of my upbringing as well was hanging around a lot of comic shops. I started working from the age of 14, and I remember taking, paychecks and hanging out in Mississauga comic shops, getting to know people and talk about the latest storylines and whatnot. And it was really interesting as a development for me, because I started with, everyone, I feel like most people start in the world of comics around the same place, where it's like Marvel and DC are basically your entire world.
Yes.
That's all there is.
Yes.
But I had older friends in high school who sat me down and started teaching me about like Vertigo and Image and all these other things, where I'm like, you can put that in a comic? What is this? Like, what? My mind was blown. And so now some of I've tend to collect more trade paperbacks than anything else. So I have all of Robert Kirkman's Invincible. I have all of John Constantine Hellblazer. Fables was another one. Like, there's a bunch there that I have for, I reread them often, and I have them so the kids will read them when they get older, because like, here's an actually good story. Like, I know what you're looking at on Netflix with cartoons and everything like that. Here's good stuff that I can help partake, that you can partake of and add to your world. One of my favorite story of all time actually is Lone Wolf and Cub.
Yes.
Which is what it's in the English version of it. It's 28 volumes, I think. I have every last one. I've reread them 10 times over.
Oh, wow.
And I'm usually okay to lend comics to people if they want to like learn about a story or whatnot. Lone Wolf and Cub will never leave my side. That is just staying in my permanent collection because it's just too good a story. But all that taught me a lot about storytelling, and goes into how I develop my blog posts later, and how I go about taking care of podcasts and videos and things like that. And I actually did a stint in the early 2000s where I had tables in Artist Alley and different comic conventions, and worked at selling my own comic stories and whatnot. It didn't really pan out yet. I haven't given up, but I definitely went down another, more social norm corporate track for a while. you could hear the disdain in my voice as I say that, where I'm like, ugh, yeah, I had to go like do all the stuff people expected of me for a while. And now that I've done that, now I'm like, oh, look, I can get back to the more creative side of my life, and it is amazing, and I'm getting back into it. But that's kind of where I'm coming from. I've had comics as part of my life for ages. Comics, cartoons, and video games, I say, is the, diet of champions. And whenever my kids are having too much screen time, I'm like, well, it can't screw them up that badly. It's more the nature of the content they're absorbing than the actual action of absorbing the content. So I'm always like just making sure they're watching good things that, aren't horrible. But yeah, comics are really part of my lifeblood when it comes to it. I'm trying to draw more and more these days because it's so much easier now with iPads than it used to be back when I had my tablet and my desktop. And I'd be like, okay, if I get home at this time, I get this many hours of drawing and I'll be okay. So yeah, that's me. How about you?
Very, very similar in that I've always been obsessed with drawing and doodling. It's just I know some would say almost like a nervous habit. If I'm sitting watching TV, I'm on the phone, I will have a pad of paper next to me and I'll be doodling away. Even if I'm in a meeting, I'll be in a staff meeting and I'll have my notes on one side and I'll have my sketchbook on the other. And I find that I'm always drawing, always doodling away. And much of the early art influence that I started to absorb came through comic books. I remember being a kid, waking up, Saturday morning and watching Super Friends, and then seeing interests, I guess, in superheroes. I had an older cousin who would give me hand-me-down comic books, and I was just amazed at this static medium that was so entertaining, and the magic that would happen in going from panel to panel, and my imagination would fill in all this little blank space. And the medium of comic books as a form of storytelling just amazed me. And as I grew older, I continued to draw obsessively. And then it came to a point where I had to sort of, pick a career that would, I guess, be socially normal and acceptable. And I found graphic design, and I enjoyed graphic design. So it was still in the realm of being creative and using my skills. But I entered the field at a time where the technology had changed. So while I was still at school, I was learning traditional media as well as working with computers. And the more I worked with computers, I enjoyed technology. I love technology, but I missed getting my hands dirty. And so I would move about, and from graphic design, I went into animation. More digital animation was the 90s. And then a colleague of mine who I was working with, him and I just sort of left the digital world and we started working together in more of a fine art world, where I was a little bit lacking and he was very strong in. So he took me under his wing and he taught me how to oil paint and how to restore paintings. And I spent a number of years in the fine art world doing that until I found that I enjoyed working with a lot of our new hirees. And I entered the world of teaching. And I've been teaching visual arts now for about 16 years. So I've never really left the art world. I've always kept a toe in there, in those waters. But from teaching, my passion for comic books have always been there. And I've always tried to squeeze in a comic book lesson here and there. And I will make reference to the way comic book artists are able to create a visual narrative. And I would do examples and I would bring examples into my classroom and my students say, "Sir, you got to do this," So over the past few years, I've been slowly working towards creating my own book and creating my own stories. And a couple of years back, I had a web series that I had out, That Little Big Girl, which I had some positive feedback, but there's something about the tangible element of holding a book in your hand that I was really, really big on doing. So slowly, the Gathering Place, which is the current book I'm looking at promoting and putting out into stores, into trying to get into everyone's hands, came about. So it's been an exciting journey. But yeah, it's nice to see that there are others out there like me who are that passionate about art and illustration and can't get their minds out of comic books and creating our own stories.
For sure. So the Gathering Place is an anthology. How
I
many
call
artists
it
do you
an
have on it?
anthology, but I'm the only artist and the only writer on the book. So I don't know if technically that is really an anthology. What I've tried to do is change the my style of illustration from story to story. Making sure that the techniques, whether it be working with watercolor or digital coloring, matches the tone of the story. And this way, there's a clear break from chapter to chapter, and it keeps the stories fresh and hopefully relative to the reader. I don't know. So I was always had a little apprehensive about putting the word anthology out there, but it sort of suits what I'm hoping to do with the series. So far I have a list of biographies that I want to do up for about 3, maybe 4 issues. And it really feels like an anthology series. So that's what I'm going to call it until someone corrects me or comes up with a better term.
Right. I like it. No, that's cool. I mean, the thing that often happens when it comes down to art and artists, especially when you take on a dauntingly large project, is that you just get so tied to one particular style. You feel like, okay, I need this to have the same visual style from beginning to end. And if it changes at all, like I know that's why a lot of people don't start when it comes to web series, because they worry that they don't have the skill level they want in order to tell the story the right way without really realizing that things will evolve over time and change. It's just the nature of how it works. But yeah, I appreciate the fact that you're using numerous different styles in one place to just that I suppose they lend themselves well to the story being told in each individual case.
Yes, and it's been challenging. I'm also trying to explore new styles that or work in different techniques that I've never worked with before. And there's actually been one story in the first issue where I try and mimic the style of the artist that I'm doing the biography on. So it was an actual learning process. Quite exciting too. Again, this is where the teacher becomes the student. And yes. I enjoy it. I absolutely enjoy getting my hands dirty and discovering new things. And again, this is something I can take into the classroom and share with my students. They get a kick out of it as well. And they also get to learn something too.
Very cool. So as a fellow dad, a question I have is, what do your kids think about it? Do they think it's cool? Are they just kind of like, that's just something dad does? Like, what's their take on all the art and how it all comes together?
They absolutely love it. They're incredible supporters of my work. And I'm incredibly fortunate that they allow me the time to get down into the studio and work. They're incredibly understanding. I mean, there are times where they will flat out, tell me, Daddy, we got to play video games, or Daddy, we got to watch this movie. And I will say, yes, we will. Mm-hmm. And then other times where I say, you know what, I need to go down and do a little bit of work, and then go, okay. You have a couple of hours. I go, okay, thanks. And I'm happy they give me that permission to do so. But I oftentimes will bring them down into the studio, and they're both interested in illustration as well, especially my older son. So he'll sit down and he has his own sketchbook. And obviously, he's way into the superheroes, so he's very big on anything DC and Marvel. Mm-hmm. And I'm letting him run through his course. And when he gets a little bit older and get into his teen years, then we'll get into the more serious stuff and expand outside of that. But cool. Yeah, he definitely loves to sit down and draw. And I think there's this. For me, I get a great sense of pride being able to work side by side with my kids, them on their own projects and me on my own projects. But I've been able to come up with a really good balance, and a big part of it. They're now 12 and 10 years old. So they're very understanding of when I need to go down into the studio, which oftentimes when they let me go down, I know they're upstairs causing trouble anyway. So that's probably why they let me go down there, because they're upstairs causing trouble and getting into the mayhem that a 10 or 12-year-old likes to get into. So.
Well, you give me some hope there, because right now my kids are 3 and 5, and they think that the fact that daddy draws sometimes is really cool. And I was like, oh, how long? Like, will this last? Will they one day be like, I don't know, Dad. I don't know. You may want to like be like all the other grown-ups and just do something like really normal.
It's funny. I've spoken with other artists who are in the comic book realm, and some their kids are into it, and others they're not, and they're not overly impressed that, mommy and daddy have a book on the shelves, and I guess until their friends find out, and then then becomes a cool factor, and then they're probably, oh wow, yeah, your dad draws this and your mom draws that, yeah, that's cool. So for now, I think because I was bringing them into the studio when they were very, very young, and kids at a very young age love to be creative, love getting their hands dirty. I think they always saw that as part of our playtime. So yeah, and I think they grew into it, and they also see how passionate I am about it. So it's great to have that support at home.
So what comics are you into?
Wow. It has.
I'm all about the loaded questions. It has to be as loaded as possible.
Yeah, it has. As much as it's changed over the years, I always come back to superheroes. It always comes back to superheroes, and oddly enough, I still have a fascination with a lot of the DC heroes. And I don't know if this stems back from my first exposure being to, Super Friends, being a kid from the 70s. That was my first exposure to anything superhero related. But it's that the possibility that this, or the connection to mythology. I adored all sorts of mythology, Greek mythology, Norse mythology, reading that stuff as a teenager and drawing these connections. And so having these epic tales and seeing these characters that are larger than life, always fascinating. And for me, it's escapism. I can get into, I go back and I reread, issues of Sandman and Hellboy. Absolutely love that stuff. Love that stuff. I got my wife into reading Saga. Nice. She absolutely adores the series. I love it. It's brilliant. By far, some of the best sci-fi stuff that's out there anywhere. But I'm always drawn back to the superheroes and these mythic tales and these larger than life characters that are beyond us. They almost set this tone of being a role model, and I've enjoyed seeing these characters, being tarnished over the years and made become more real. And obviously that's where you have, Marvel always succeeding in the fact that they've always had these characters in a gray area or tarnished, and we relate to them on a human level. And I think that's the success of any great stories, where we see ourselves in that role. You had mentioned Invincible. That's a perfect. I was hooked instantly, first issue, because I saw myself in that role. And I fit in there. I saw the imperfections in the character. I saw the relationship of family and how important it was to all these characters and how they all intertwined. And it's good escapism, but it also brings you back to real life and says, oh yeah, I have these issues in my life too. Wow. Yeah, just thinking of a list of things. Yeah, Hellboy has actually been one I go back to often, and my 12-year-old son, I've introduced him to it as well, and I think he enjoys the artwork more so than the story. And again, he sees the simplicity behind it, and I try to explain how not simple it is.
Yeah.
And I remember when I've been following Mike Mignola's work almost since the very beginning, and I remember seeing his work transform. I remember picking up the World of Krypton miniseries, fell in love with that. Gotham by Gaslight is a book I've said I will be buried with. I absolutely love that book. It was the first Elseworlds book that DC put out. The writing is brilliant, and I think that was Mark Mignola at his finest. And then he came out with Hellboy. When I first looked at it, it was like, oh. And then I looked deeper, and it was like, oh. Yeah, so it's.
Yeah.
I remember a lot of friends of mine, and because I just started college at the time, and they were like, "Oh, this stuff is pretty simple," and I'm looking at it and go, yeah, but look at it, and it's the mastery of working with shadows and how the shadows will direct the reader, and it's absolutely brilliant. It's all in the storytelling. And he's just phenomenal.
Well, I think that's something that people really don't appreciate that as much in almost any subgenre, which is the entire idea of passing the torch, where you have these individuals who can open your eyes to what's possible with a medium, what's possible with an art form, etc., that people may have not considered before. There's always going to be someone who comes and does things in a different way that people might not think was viable or useful, and then suddenly that becomes a new thing.
That's true.
It's the new way of doing things that people wouldn't have considered before, because everyone got used to doing things a certain way, and then when that one person comes in and changes what everyone deems to be possible with an art form, everything starts to evolve some more from there.
That's true, and I think there was a definite change in the 90s with comics and comic book illustration in what can and can't be done. Mike Mignola, obviously, but Frank Miller and the Sin City work. Again, changing what everyone thought could be done with comics. I, like many at the time, at the early 90s, I mean, with the whole Image, the explosion with Image Comics, and these illustrators that were phenomenal in creating the very detailed drawings, and with hatching and cross hatching on top of hatching. It was incredible. And then, I mean, I grew up reading works from Neil Adams and Jim Aparo. So I appreciated all the technical elements that went into all that hatching. But then when I saw the Sin City and the Hellboy stuff, and saw how, quote unquote, simplified the visuals can be, but how strong and effective the storytelling is, I think that's where there was a really big change in my focus as an illustrator. That on the technical side, yeah, that's one thing, but it's storytelling. If you can tell a story with any sort of level of illustration ability, I think that's where the magic comes in, is that ability to communicate visually.
For sure. Yeah. I think it's one of those things where people might oversimplify what it means to be able to, draw a comic or really put together a story, but they don't often see how much of, there's the entire idea of blood, sweat, and tears, and putting all that into a comic and making, or anything really, and what it takes to make something work. But really, it's more, I feel like, it's soul. You're basically putting your essence into it to make it as representative of what it is you are trying to communicate through that medium. And that takes a lot. It's an exhausting process to make that happen.
Oh, yes. Oh, it definitely is. Yeah, it's trying to convince people that I don't merely draw pretty pictures.
Mm-hmm.
That there's a sense of direction, and I am playing with people's attention and directing them to look one area and move to another area, and they don't realize it. It's funny because I explain this to my students, and we do, whether it be some form of art criticism, we'll look at fine art paintings, but we also look at, I teach an illustration course as well, and we take a look at comics. And when I dissect a page or I dissect a work of art, and I take them through the steps of how the artist initially had the viewer enter into the work of art, and how the artist guided them throughout the piece or guided throughout the page, panel to panel, even with the word balloons and all that stuff. And you don't realize that you're moving in that path in a natural, very relaxed form. And when I let them know that they have that power, that they can do this as well, they get really excited. And it's one of the first times that I see in my students that they really have this positive energy about communicating visually. It's not just about pretty pictures. It's about telling this story with a beginning and middle and an end.
That's a really good way to put it. And you actually, something you said there, I think it just became the title of this episode, which is playing with people's attention, because that's a really interesting way to look at things that it applies to so many mediums, but I don't think people really recognize the power of getting someone to stop and look at somewhere else or pay attention to something else that they wouldn't have done otherwise. That is so key.
I've through studying the medium of comics, I've gained a greater appreciation for film and television, and the work that storyboard artists do. And again, it's that direction, and cinematographers, and again, anyone who works in this field of visual communication, and the power that they have in directing attention and getting us to find articles and artifacts that are necessary for us to have the whole story. It's quite fantastic. And even going back, and I used to be more of a movie buff than I am now. And I used to watch a lot of old silent films, and just a way of communicating how over the top and over exaggerated some of the motions and movements would be. But you see how effective that storytelling is in pointing in a direction and communicating that every element that's in that frame or in that panel is necessary for the reader to establish, and then to guide them to find all those elements to get the full impact of that panel, of that message. I can go on. I can go on. My love of that. It's like, I start to geek out about it, and my students will look at me like, okay, sir, we get it. You love this stuff. But usually in a class of about 30, I'll have about 2 or 3 who are also into to comics as well. And so they geek out as well, and they go, yeah, sir, I can do this. Yeah, of course you can. Go for it. Yeah.
That's super cool. So how long did it take to put the Gathering Place together?
This first issue came about in about 10 to 11 months. Considering that there's quite a bit of research involved in doing so, because I'm limited to the number of pages, or I limited myself to a number of pages to tell the story. I researched their entire biography, and what I was looking for was a moment in their lives that was a turning point or an inspirational moment that could be used to inspire other artists. So with this first issue, it's a 20-page book with 4 chapters. The first chapter is actually a land recognition or land acknowledgement that I wrote, acknowledging the legacy of Indigenous people in Toronto, and also their legacy to storytelling. It's a big part of their culture, and it's a big part of what I do. So I wanted to sort of have that passing the torch moment. And because A Gathering Place involves biographies with Toronto artists, I thought it was very appropriate to recognize Toronto's history, our long history, with Indigenous people, and then with more recent artists. But also in researching artists, I wanted to have a good mix of names that we'd be familiar with, and find a story or element that might be new and fresh for readers. But I also wanted to find artists that, I don't know, maybe only a handful of Canadians would know who they were, and shine a light on them, and showcase artists that maybe they need a little bit more recognition, or maybe a second look. Maybe they were overlooked, and now we can look back and say, hey, they definitely brought something strong to the table in terms of the quality of their artwork, but also they have a great story too. I love history. I love learning about people, and so this is a good opportunity for me to learn, and then also to share with others. And initial research started like most people today. I went on the internet and looked up artists, and then if there was something that was of interest, I headed down to the Toronto Reference Library. And I was impressed with the wealth of information that they have there. And in fact, I found prints of artwork and old gallery exhibit, like flyers and reference material that was just incredibly helpful for visual reference, but also for just background information on who these artists were.
I have to appreciate how Toronto-centric this entire conversation is, only because I tend to podcast with people all over the place. And even though I'm, one of the few, let's call it used to be dad bloggers, but I'm really more of like, I guess I'm just a guy who blogs at this point, and I do a number of different disciplines, but there's not many males in Toronto who write and create that much. So it's always been kind of like, I know I'm in Toronto and I tell everyone I'm from Toronto, but I don't spend a lot of time talking about Toronto. Mm-hmm. And so I actually, while you're chatting, I just took a peek over at the Kickstarter page to just refresh myself on things. And I was like, yeah, it's almost like, I'm not going to cheapen anything by saying this, but I feel like it's kind of in the same way what Scott Pilgrim did for Toronto from a pop culture standpoint. This is doing it from a more historical standpoint, which I find very interesting because you don't often see Toronto representation in the comics field. Like, it gets mentioned, and you may have, odd things like a John Up to Canada and the My Girlfriend in Canada type jokes, but you don't really see love for Toronto in things of more a grander scale. It tends to be, more small, montage or biographical pieces that artists will do about their own life, but not the longer history of how it all comes together. So I really appreciate that.
Oh, good. That's really what I wanted to get across with this book is I guess my love for Toronto. And I know anyone who lives in Toronto, who's ever lived in Toronto, it's an exciting place to live, and it's sort of like a love letter to the city, but also to the rich art, culture, and history that has been here. So it definitely is work I'm very, very passionate about, because it is, my hometown, and celebrating other artists, like myself who spent whatever length of time in the city working, growing, developing, learning, and creating work. And in researching, the great thing that I found is that it's such a strong, supportive community. whether it be within the fine arts community and then talking with other artists in the comics community. Incredibly supportive, incredibly generous, always willing to help. And I think that's the theme that actually carries this first issue through, which wasn't deliberate. But I found by the time I got to the very end, there's a sense of mentorship and education. And I really think that's one of the strengths in the Toronto arts community is just that, is this sense of mentorship and helping out and giving new talent an opportunity and an opening to really shine.
Yeah, for sure. I that kind of reminds me of something, because one of the names I saw Sandy reach out to was Ty Templeton.
Yeah.
And I used to do his banking.
Oh yeah.
Like 15 years ago. And I was like, oh, Ty. I remember that just like he would hand me a check from, a work he'd done for maybe DC or whoever. And I'd just be kind of like, wait, you get paid for what? This is the thing? Like, this is how much you could make it? I was like just blown away, because there it was like, something I just kind of did and noodle around on things with my friends. I was like, wait. You have a legitimate career just drawing cool stuff? What the heck? And it blew my mind. But I remember that being a moment where not necessarily like I was looking to become have that become my career, but I saw there was a viability to good ideas and good talent and technique and practice. And I think that's something that definitely kept me vested in being able to keep learning, keep developing, and just seeing where it would all take me.
Yeah, that's, what, I think that's a great advice, actually. It's just to keep at it. And, for you to have that exposure to Ty Templeton and see that it is, a potentially viable career path, I think that is very inspiring to a lot of young artists to possibly pursue a career. It's not an easy. It's true. It's definitely not an easy to do full time. And it probably wouldn't be something I would recommend. But the good thing about, I'd say, not just the Toronto community, I'd say the whole Golden Horseshoe is a hub. It's a hub for creative talent. I don't want to, throw in the whole Hollywood North, and because that term gets used a lot when speaking of Toronto or the surrounding area. But there's such a creative hub in the Golden Horseshoe, from film to television productions. The huge comic book community. The more I'm, entering into the field, the more I'm realizing how many, illustrators who work for, either DC or Marvel still live in the Toronto area. Yeah. So it's definitely a huge hub. And then there's the video game world and the animation world that are strong. So it's, when I have a student, or when I have a parent, more actually, when they come in and they say, "Oh, my child is very interested in pursuing a career in the arts. What's the viability?" And I would say it's challenging, but it's very possible for where we live, because we're such a huge hub. Yeah. So if they're passionate about it and they're willing to work for it, they can have a very successful and a really enjoyable career in that field.
For sure. All right. Well, I'm not going to take up too much more of your time, largely because my 3-year-old just snuck out of his room and are now playing in the other room. And I'm just like, I should eventually get this child to bed.
Oh, they do that.
So, but I want you to know that you've definitely gained a fan out of me, and I will definitely support your Kickstarter.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
You've come up with a really cool idea. I feel like when it comes to talking about Toronto in general, we get pretty jaded in Canada about it. We tend to focus on the modern center of the universe, Toronto, instead of the long path that it's taken to become a city. And I always like to throw around the trivia with people that Montreal used to be the largest city in Canada back in the 60s before things changed.
Yes. Oh,
And before,
yes.
immigration and whatnot changed the laws and changed what the industries were like as well. And so it's very interesting to kind of look at what Canada's looks like at different stages in its developments, and any well put together piece of whether it's literature, art, or whatnot that does help to speak to that is something I'm always interested in. So yeah, you'll be hearing and seeing from me as I integrate it into some of the other language I have going on in the month to come. So yeah, let's make some magic happen.
Oh, that's good to hear. Oh, awesome. Thank
No
you.
problem. Is there anything else you'd like to share with everyone other than the Kickstarter, which I will post links for and everything? Anything else going on that you wanted to let people know that you're up to?
I was recently accepted to table at the Vancouver Comic Arts Festival.
Hey.
In May, so I'm very, very excited about that. It will actually coincide with the release of The Gathering Place. So May 2019 is going to be a very busy time for me.
Very cool.
And I'm also looking at tabling at Fan Expo in August here in Toronto. It's the biggest convention we have in Canada.
Yep.
It's going to be huge and massive, and I hope to reach out to as many people as possible.
For sure. I mean, and one more question, because I'm
Yes.
starting to appreciate more of what the Gathering Place represents the more we talk here. So this is really just the first of what hopes to be many to come.
Oh, yes. As I've said, I have definitely the first 3 issues I've selected artists for.
Mm-hmm.
So the first issue, in terms of biographies, we have Tom Thompson.
Okay.
Probably Canada's most famous our artist, but what I'm doing is that I'm focusing on his time before he really started exploring the fine arts and painting. So he's actually a graphic artist working for a printing company in Toronto. And this is actually where he met many of the future members of the Group of Seven. So I found the location of this printing company, and I have their address in the book and architectural references.
Wow.
So I went all out. I went all out for the research. So I figured, since I'm using the biggest name in Canadian art history, let's look for some much lesser known names. And so I found Marjorie Pigott, who is a Japanese Canadian artist. She left Japan just prior to the Second World War. And she was a master of Nanga. It's a watercolor ink based artwork, not to be confused with manga. So she was a Nanga master. She came to Canada and continued to teach in that traditional method. And then she decided to break from that and develop her own sort of mix of this traditional watercolor with an abstract style that she developed, which I struggled to adapt because I challenged myself to having to learn how to do that. Mm-hmm. But I enjoyed it very much. And then I end with a story that's actually very close to me, because I spent some time restoring artwork, and it's about a painter who was the grandson of a painter who did one of the works that I would eventually go on to restore. So I was able to, at one point, meet the grandson, who was also an artist in his own right. He was actually a third-generation artist here in Canada. And his family was responsible for 450 paintings across Canada. So it's nice to be able to have something very personal to me to put in there as well, not something just out of the history books. But for the second issue, I have an all-female artist selection, because I think that's very important to get out there, that we have a strong history of very talented female Toronto-based artists. And for the third issue, it will be an all comic book illustrator related issue. So with the third issue, I've already started looking at Canadian comic book illustrators from the 1940s, which is sort of the golden age of both American and Canadian comic book periods. And we look more, I bring it more into a more contemporary period of artists for that third issue.
Well, it sounds to me like you've chosen the most uninteresting topics possible, Nelson. I don't know how this is going to do well. Oh my god, no, I'm kidding. It sounds amazing.
Well, you know what? I'm a little apprehensive about the history part, but I know there are a lot of history buffs out there, and having that Toronto-centric appeal to it may have, I guess, a little excitement for the local readers and local talent. But I'm sure once word starts to spread, I think the book will pick up traction elsewhere. But I'm also looking at expanding beyond the Toronto.
Oh, of course. I mean, you don't want to pigeonhole yourself into one thing.
No. The Gathering Place really is just a start. And then from there, I'll explore more artists, because there are so many incredible Canadian artists. But I will focus on Canadian artists, of course, to explore.
Well, I will be keeping in the loop, and hopefully, all the success to you, man. It sounds like a really cool thing you're doing.
Thank you so much.
No problem.
Good to hear. Good to hear.
Thanks for your time. I'm going to wrap it up and go chase this little rugrat of mine. But I will, everyone, you need to go check out Nelson's Kickstarter. I will put the link in the show notes and tweets and other places so you guys can connect to it. And Nelson, thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
I really appreciate it too. Thank you so much for your support and for all the kind words.
All right. And that was Nelson Cayetano, everyone. And we will, you will all check him out, or else, I'll be very mad with everyone, and I have no qualms sharing that online. So go do it, guys. All right. Bye, everyone. So there we go. And before we wrap things up, I need to thank Nelson not only for tolerating my constant muting as I dealt with my toddler who'd escaped from his room and sorely needed to go back to bed, but also for being so patient with me getting this episode out. 2019's been on some next dish so far, and I need just about all the grace that people are willing to give me. But I'm tapping out. Life's got no shortage of things for me to do, and unfortunately it's not going to get done through podcasting alone. So all y'all be well out there and chin up. I'm sure winter will come to an end eventually. That may just be me trying to convince myself, but I'm done. I'm so done. Anyway, in any case, have a great week ahead, and we'll catch you on the next Chatting with Casey. Until then, bye-bye. I just realized I was on mute. There's an entire section there I'm going to have to cut out because I was like, oh, look, I started talking. And I'm like, wow, there's no sound waves happening. Don't worry. This will just be filler later that I'll just move around. It'll be great. I know how to podcast, obviously. Okay.